Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. We're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with climate activists Michaela Loach and Tom Burke, chairman of the E3G think tank. First up, the government has promised to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in low-carbon technologies as part of its net zero strategy. But critics have warned it won't cover the cost of the green transition, and consumers will end up footing the bill. It raises questions about how the costs should be shared out between the government, taxpayers and businesses. So, who should pay for net zero? Tom, to you first. We know that there are big changes that need to be made in order to move towards net zero. This week, the focus has been on that of heat pumps at a cost to consumers as well as government. But whose responsibility ultimately is it to foot these massive bills?
Well, in some sense, it's all of our responsibility because it's all of us who are creating the problem. But how we pay is very much a question whether governments, which policies they choose for distributing those costs. And if governments choose bad policies, then the cost will fall unfairly on the people who can least afford it. But if it chooses the right policies, then what we'll be doing is making sure that the taxpayer pays some of it, consumers pay some of it, business pays some of it. And that's a question, therefore, of how the government chooses to set up policy framework so that we can all respond in a way that's appropriate to our own particular circumstances and, of course, our own means.
So how we pay for it, Michaela, but also when, the timing of when we deal with these bills. Do we need to pay for it now, or can we leave it to future generations?
So I think I also kind of want to go back to the question of who is responsible, because I think too often we make this too broad. We say that we are responsible for the climate crisis, or humanity is, when in reality, when 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions since 1988, there are particular people, a very small group of people and companies and systems that are responsible for this problem. And therefore, I think that it's important that we kind of zoom out on that a bit more and stop making it about all individuals, many of whom are marginalised, and instead make it about these industries and these businesses. And that's why I think that these businesses, and especially the fossil fuel industry, should be paying now. Currently, the UK government gives huge amounts of subsidies to this industry. So in the North Sea, since 2016, the UK government has given £4 billion of public money to this industry, and a lot of these companies haven't been paying tax. So imagine if instead these companies are being taxed well now, and they are the ones who caused the crisis, if they were instead being the ones funding the transition. And I think that they could do that, and they should be doing that now.
And Tom, have we got political consensus on this, on how and when we pay?
No, we haven't got political consensus on how. There are some people who think we can delay, some people politically who think we can somehow put off delaying paying for this and for government playing the part it needs to pay in playing. And that's kind of really very silly at the end of the day. You know, I listened to the Chancellor the other day talk about his reluctance to borrow more money because it would impose costs on our children. Well, if he's not prepared to borrow the money to invest in doing the damage we're doing to the climate, then he certainly will be making our children pay, but they won't be paying in money. They'll be paying in very damaged lives. So I think it's really important for government to play its part, and Michaela's quite right. It's very important that businesses pays, and she was absolutely right to point out to the fact there's something completely silly by paying fossil fuel companies subsidies at the same time as you're trying to get other people to pay in order to undo the damage being done by those subsidies.
Michaela, I can see you nodding along with Tom on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it is completely outrageous that this government that says they have no magic money tree, or that they don't have the money to fund the climate, the just transition that we need, are then paying loads of public money to North Sea oil and gas companies who are multi-billion-pound companies that don't need this money and that are actually laying off so many workers in the North Sea currently and are trying to expand into new oil fields. They're just being promoted and polluting, and it's completely ridiculous. And especially when, my generation, the younger generation, are going to be the ones footing the bills for the decommissioning costs of these rigs that are being built now. It just feels completely ludicrous. And I think that when we're talking about who should be paying, we need to be making sure that it's the people who have caused this crisis.
OK, let's move on now to one way that companies are dealing with global warming emissions, and that is carbon offsetting. Firms plan to reach net zero through planting trees or restoring carbon sinks like peatlands. This is so the amount of CO2 absorbed can balance out the amount of CO2 they emit. But is carbon offsetting a viable long-term solution? Tom, what are your thoughts? Is it a good tool to help us reduce emissions?
It's a very important tool to have in our toolkit for dealing with climate change, but it's only going to be a useful tool if people believe it's real, the integrity of the offsets. In other words, if you're putting an atom of carbon into the atmosphere today, you've got to be able to point to somewhere where you're taking an atom of carbon out of the atmosphere today. You can't somehow borrow from the future. And I think quite a lot of the schemes seem to be drifting into somehow thinking we will put carbon up now and we'll take it out later. And I think that will really not sustain public confidence, not sustain even economic confidence in offsetting. And that will destroy one of the tools we'll need to play a part, not a dominant part, but certainly a part.
Michaela, what are your thoughts? Does it work, or are carbon offsets a smokescreen, effectively, a way of offsetting guilt and saying, well, if we pay, we can carry on doing what we've always done?
I think that's absolutely it. I think that I do see that it's a tool in a toolkit, but I don't think it should be the one that we're focusing on. I think that we know what we need to do is actually stop producing as many emissions. That should be the priority, not trying to do some sort of creative accounting to make it look like we're not causing as much harm. Because basically what carbon offsets allow a lot of big businesses and countries like the UK to do is continue polluting and emitting and continue fossil fuel extraction by saying that you're balancing it out somewhere else. And actually, a lot of these carbon offsets aren't as reliable as they say they are. If you're doing tree planting, if those trees don't end up growing to full maturity, if they end up like dying in different ways, and that's not actually going to offset as much carbon as you're saying it is. But also there's an important kind of thing to bring in here around justice, because a lot of these carbon offsetting activities, they are kind of like modern day colonialism. It's called carbon colonialism, and how they go into many countries all over the world and seize land from indigenous people and grow monoculture of trees. This is happening in Kenwa, in the Sengwer community in Kenya at the moment for the UK government's offsetting kind of strategy. And it's really important that we bring awareness to the fact that this offsetting can actually cause a huge amount of harm, and in many ways it can also kind of repeat the same harm that has caused this crisis in the first place. And I think that we need to make sure we're centering justice, and I don't think that sometimes offsetting can do that.
One very brief thought from you, Tom. Is it a long-term solution?
Yeah, I suspect we're going to go on needing carbon offset, but Kayla's right to say there are limits to what the party can play. We have to scale down investment in fossil fuels at the same time as we're scaling up investment in the renewables, the net zero alternatives. And that's a difficult task. We've got to you can't just switch off the fossil fuels, or we'd all be having the kind of problems Michaela's worried about carbon offsetting costing if we actually use it to destroy people's possibility of living. So we've got to make a good match between those two things, and offsetting will play a role in making that.
Tom and Michaela, we are running out of time. I'm going to have to interrupt you. Thank you very much indeed. Do stay tuned, though. Coming up next,